What is up, everybody, and welcome to the culmination of the Indiana Jones review series and my review of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. If you haven't already seen, I reviewed Dial of Destiny a couple of weeks ago, and over the past week or more, I've been going over the previous films, so this is the last one, and then tomorrow we're going to rank all 5 of these films and talk about them one last time. So Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out in May of 2008, almost 20 years after the previous film, The Last Crusade, and I remember all of the hype was insane for this, especially because Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were coming back, and Harrison Ford obviously hadn't done an Indiana Jones movie in so long that just all the fans were raging for it. And it's one of those movies that, for some odd reason, I didn't actually see in theaters. I think it's because it came out the month that I graduated from high school, and so I was just focused on so many other things. I didn't see this until months later, and way after all of the fans and the critics and everybody just lambasted this thing throughout the rest of the summer.
I want to be a good archaeologist. You gotta get out of the library!
And so maybe it's because I already had my expectations primed before I watched this thing for the first time, or maybe it's because I'm more of a casual Indiana Jones fan than most people my age, but I have never hated this movie. It's got its issues for sure, and it is no question the worst in this franchise. But I still think it's fairly entertaining, and I don't think it's anywhere near as insufferable to watch as a lot of people make it out to be. Starting off with the positives, I think that Harrison Ford did a great job at jumping back into the role of Indiana Jones. Very similar to the way that I thought he did a great job of jumping back into the role even later with Dial of Destiny. He just owns this character, he owns this role, and seeing the character at various points in his life, I feel like Harrison Ford brings something different to the character every single time. So this was when they were first kind of exploring older Indiana Jones and him not necessarily being a spring chicken and being able to do all the things in the previous adventures. And they play that up a little bit, sometimes for comedic value, sometimes just for a different visual in the action sequences. And I think that Harrison Ford brings a charm to this role in this 4th film that makes it to where no matter how dumb the sequences might get here and there, I still really enjoy watching what is going on because he's so damn good in the fedora.
Rusky son of a bitch! Indiana Jones.
His interaction with all the different characters, even the new characters like Mutt, and when Marion comes back, especially whenever it's revealed that he's the father of Mutt, there's a lot of really good, funny dialogue there with him previously telling him, oh, it's okay, you ain't got to go back to school, just whatever you have fun with, whatever you enjoy, that's what you should pursue, kid. And then he finds out he's his son, and he's like, motherfucker, you going back to school. He brought a bit more of a fun angle to it, and they had already kind of made that transition from Temple of Doom to The Last Crusade. Here, I think they took it even further with Indiana Jones being a little bit more playful with what is going on, no matter how ridiculous and how terrifying the situation may be. And so when I'm in the mood for the goofier and a little bit more lighthearted Indiana Jones, I like what Harrison Ford brings and what the Indiana Jones character does in this 4th film. Despite going way, way, way over the top in a few scenes, which I will get to later, I do think that Steven Spielberg does capture a lot of that Indiana Jones magic in this movie. He does still have that fun sense of adventure and spectacle here. I mean, it doesn't look as impressive as the previous 3 films. It has a weird gloss to the cinematography, and of course, just things get a little silly at some points, but when they're on the more serious track, when they're on the more dialogue-centric scenes, when we're going through the tomb raiding and some of the more grounded action sequences here, I think it does have that Indiana Jones magic that we all go for. Arguably even more so than Dial of Destiny, even though Dial of Destiny I think is a little bit better movie than this.
Don't get clever, Boris. You don't know him. Know him! Know him! You don't know him! You don't know him! You don't know him! You don't know!
By the 3rd act, you always get 2 things in an Indiana Jones film. You get a gross out scene and you get a supernatural element. And we'll talk about the supernatural element a little later, but the gross part of this one, the monster, the icky part, is these fire ants. And I thought that was just an awesome sequence. I thought it was really tense. I thought that the sequence where the guy is actually being devoured by the fire ants was really gnarly. And it brought a lot of tension to what could have been just a regular fight scene that would have been entertaining enough. But you have these gigantic fire ants coming towards them, and Just like in Temple of Doom with the dinner scene and the snake scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark and the rats in Last Crusade, there's always a creepy crawly somewhere in the midst of Indiana Jones. And this one's actually one of my favorites. I really enjoyed this movie being in the 50s as well. You get a really good soundtrack here and there among the John Williams score, which probably the least interesting of his 5 Indiana Jones scores, but it's still a great score. It's still classic John Williams Indiana Jones stuff. But having like some Elvis music and having the greasers versus the jocks and that whole Cold War setting going on, it brings a little bit of a different visual, a different vibe to the movie, where the first 3 felt pretty similar, especially Last Crusade and Raiders, of course, being pretty close in the same proximity. But this one being in the 50s, I just enjoyed what that time era brought to the movie. And finally, I really liked the narrative ending that they gave the character of Indiana Jones in this one. Even though the third act really takes us for a ringer with some of the most just ridiculous things that we're ever going to see in this franchise, when you finally get to those closing moments and he finally marries Marion and embraces Mutt as his son, and you have this optimistic view of the future for the character of Indiana Jones, I would have been fine if that was the end of the character. Dial of Destiny, I do think is a better movie to leave off on, but I think this is a better ending for the character. Moving on to the mixed aspects, and we have the character of Mutt, played by Shia LaBeouf, and he's introduced to us as a greaser, somebody who is friends with a mutual friend of Indiana Jones and is the guy who kind of sets him on the path of the adventure he goes on here. And by the midpoint of the film, it's revealed that he's actually Harrison Ford's son. He's Indiana Jones and Marion Ravenwood's son. And there's elements to his character that I like. I think that his attitude and some of his rough around the edges qualities certainly plays into what the son of Indiana Jones and Marion Ravenwood would be like. I do think that Shia LaBeouf does everything that he can with the role. And on the other side of the coin, whenever this character is trying to be a super rough, tough guy, I just never bought into it. I've never been able to buy Shia LaBeouf in tough guy roles. Maybe it's because I grew up with him and Even Stevens, and I'll always see him as Lewis Stevens. Maybe part of it's just not being able to separate the art from the artist, to where I just see all of the things that this guy has done in his personal life, and I just think he's a fucking scumbag. And so when I see him try to act tough, I just kind of laugh. But there's elements to this character that Shia LaBeouf's presence doesn't allow me to fully buy into what Mutt is supposed to be. And while I get what they're going for, it just never completely works for me. And it was to the point where you get to the end of the movie, and even though I've kind of warmed up to the character a bit, as Indiana Jones as a character has warmed up to Mutt a bit more, you get to the end with the wedding scene and that whole little tease that Steven Spielberg put in there where the hat blows in and lands at the feet of Shia LaBeouf. I mean, you're caught up in the moment of the wedding and you're like, oh, this movie was rough, but that's a sweet note to end on. You know, they finally have each other. Put that fucking hat down! What the fuck are you doing? That's not your fedora! God help the world if they were actually serious about Shia LaBeouf taking over Harrison Ford's role in the Indiana Jones franchise. I mean, can you even picture that alternative history? I mean, human sacrifice, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria! The other mixed aspect is the choice to kind of play on 50s B-movie Roswell alien films, and this was totally George Lucas's idea. If I'm not mistaken, I think Steven Spielberg and one of the producers weren't really a big fan of it, so they kind of tried to do classic Indiana Jones archaeology stuff and then compromise on some of George Lucas's wackier ideas. And this is one of those times where I genuinely feel like George Lucas just was out of touch with what this franchise needed. And, this was post prequel Star Wars George Lucas. Nothing but respect to classic George Lucas, but aliens and 50s Roswell mixed with Indiana Jones, that's to me is just like water and oil. No matter how much you shake it up, they're always going to separate. They're never completely going to come together. And so while I appreciate some of the aesthetics that brings to this movie, where you get some of the 50s era stuff, you have the Ark of the Covenant in Roswell, and all these cool little Easter eggs and things, when you start getting into the more science fiction elements of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I think it conflicts with the action-adventure side of what Indiana Jones has always been. So there's a version of this they could have done if they just toned down the George Lucas side of things. But here we have like weird compromise. And now, moving on to the negatives. And the first thing that I will say, which is again a problem that's carried over in Dial of Destiny while not quite as egregious, is that when they got away from practical movie making, the Indiana Jones franchise lost its way. As soon as it was a lot of green screen and computer-generated backgrounds and CGI effects and all of that digital bullshit that just bogs down movies like this, it makes it almost unrecognizable as an Indiana Jones film. That's the one element of these later two films that just boggles my mind, of how the same people who made the original trilogy for $20 million back in the day and had all these amazing practical sets and stunt work and action sequences decided that making everything look fake as fuck was absolutely the way to go. I mean, you've got CGI gophers, you've got nuclear explosions, you've got Amazonian forests coming to life, you've got spaceships coming out of a fucking pyramid. I mean, it's just so over the top, so massive in scale, and so clearly created by a computer that it just loses all of that tangible reality and danger that made the original trilogy beloved classics that still stand the test of time today. And going along with that, there are a number of sequences in this movie that is just absolutely infuriating. How many people approved it? How many people storyboarded it out, wrote it into a script, approved it to be shot, saw it through its rendering phases in the CGI room, edited it into the film, and looked at it and said, you know what, that works. Baffling. When you have Steven Spielberg, arguably the greatest director who has ever lived, saying that that is okay. There's just no explanation for it. There's just no reasoning of how it's the same guy that did the original trilogy that said this was good, that put this in his movie and said this belongs in the franchise. I mean, Harrison Ford getting into a lead refrigerator and being launched 10 miles into the desert by a nuclear explosion and being bounced around like a fucking rag doll, and then just gets out and dusts himself off and carries on with his adventure. And then by the third act, man, the third act is just like one egregious, ridiculous scene after another. We would have forgiven the nuke the fridge moment, okay? There is always at least one moment in some of these Indiana Jones films that's a little ridiculous. You remember the little raft coming out of the plane in Temple of Doom? Yeah, we forgave the fuck out of that because the rest of the movie was awesome. But when you get to the third act, and you have Shia LaBeouf swinging with monkeys like Tarzan, and then you have Marion Ravenwood driving the little Jeep onto a tree branch and bending the tree down, driving off and having a tree branch smack a bunch of Russian dudes on the side of the mountain like a fly swatter, and then you get into the reveal of interdimensional beings, fuck you, aliens, and then a spaceship, a flying saucer coming out of the Pyramid of Giza or whatever the hell that was, and just the ocean caving in into this little... What the fuck?
The fuck is this?
Oh my god, what the fuck is going on?
What the fuck is this?
I mean, it's like 30, 40 straight minutes of just bullshit. And it's a shame that those sequences are so egregious because they have just overshadowed all of the really good things about this movie for so long. I mean, there's so many things that you could commend about this film as an Indiana Jones fan, but whenever you bring up Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, all anybody thinks about and talks about is Nuke in the Fridge and Tarzan Shia LaBeouf. Now, beyond those massively egregious issues with the film that everybody and their mother has been discussing since 2008, there's still some pretty integral issues to the script and to the characters, even beyond the massive, ridiculous spectacle pieces that this film is unfortunately known for. Now, the whole plot here about having, what's the character, Oxley, one of Indiana Jones' old friends and Mutt's friend that somehow got a hold of this crystal skull and left all these messages on his prison cell for them to find the skull and take the skull back to where he found it. it's just not a very compelling adventure. You never really understand the point of what they're doing. You never really understand why the Russians want it or why there's this race to get it back to where it came from. And by the time you actually get to the third act and see how much shit they have to go through to get to this pyramid, you're wondering how the fuck Oxley even got this damn thing in the first place. Is his name Oxley? Because if it's not, I'm gonna get my ass handed to me. Harold Oxley. All right. Whew. Dodge that bullet. And then speaking just on the villains themselves, where you got Cate Blanchett here as the lead Russian, and because it's the Cold War era, it's no longer the Nazi threat, it's now the Russian threat. They're just generic. They're generic as fuck. There's nothing that's interesting or stand out or intimidating or iconic whatsoever about any of the villains in this film. Like, the Nazi characters of the Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade, I don't think were necessarily the most grand villains, but there was something about them that made them pop. There was something about them, especially in Raiders, that made them stand out visually or stand out as an intimidation factor. And every single time that Cate Blanchett comes around, all I can see is that horrible fucking Dumb and Dumber haircut, and I'm just like, dude, oh, why are you here? And finally, you have the character of Mac, who I want to love every time I watch this movie because Ray Winstone is awesome, and there's an element to his character that I want to like because he's got that rough around the edges charisma to him, to where he's obviously a dick, but he's kind of like a cool dick. So I kind of want to, I want to be in that guy's corner whenever he shifts allegiances here and there. But he shifts allegiances so many fucking times in this movie that you never understand what side he's on, and you never understand what's motivating him to change sides throughout the entire thing. It's like, dude, you're going through so much bullshit in this movie, chasing this crystal skull and being a team member of Indiana Jones and then being the antagonist of Indiana Jones, and by the end of it, what did you earn? And what were you planning to earn by the end of it? Were you going to go up in the fucking spaceship too? It just, again, not really thought out in the writing. And the last thing that I will say is this: the lighting, the color grading, the cinematography, whatever they altered in the editing room to make this movie so fucking bright, it doesn't really necessarily feel like an Indiana Jones film, because the previous three films, especially the first two, had a grit about them. It was down and dirty, and Indiana Jones would be cut and bleeding and muddy and dirty and dusty, and the whole film is just so bright and clean and polished, from the way that it's shot, from the way that it's lit, to the color grading when you finally see the finished film, to just the costumes that they're all wearing. I mean, they're tomb diving, they're diving into waters, they're battling giant fire ants, and these guys never look like they even get a speck of dust on them. And so, as silly as that might sound, that dirty grit of the original films is absolutely missing here. So all in all, guys, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, you will never get an argument out of me. It is by far the worst film in this franchise. But I don't think it's terrible. I actually think it's pretty decent. Like, if this was the final Indiana Jones film, I'm one of those people that I would have been okay. Like, it's not the best note to end on. It certainly fell way below the greatness of the original trilogy, but there was enough fun to be had. There was enough of that original Spielberg Indiana Jones magic, and there was a nice ending for the character that I would have been satisfied enough. But totally understand why there's some of you that just absolutely despise this thing, and you had to have something else as a palate cleanser. I get it. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2023 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my Indiana Jones playlist so you can catch up on all the other reviews that I've done in this franchise. And keep your eyes peeled, because tomorrow we're going to rank all 5 of these things and talk about this franchise one more again. Like, share, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss that. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.